The solicitor read the will as though he were apologizing for it. Harriet Loxley sat in the small, overheated office above the chemist's in the market town of Welbury, and listened to the careful, embarrassed voice list what her great-aunt Edith had left her, and watched the faces of her cousins on the other side of the room arrange themselves into expressions of barely concealed delight. Because what Edith Loxley had left to Harriet, the niece who had visited her every fortnight for 11 years, who had driven 200 miles each way to sit with a difficult old woman that no one else could be bothered with, was a shack. Not a house, not the cottage in the village which went to cousin Marcus. Not the money, there was less of it than anyone had hoped, but what there was went, in tidy portions, to Marcus and to cousin Davina, and to a charity for retired greyhounds. To Harriet, the will left the parcel of land at Crookback Fell, together with the dwelling thereon. And the solicitor's pause before the word dwelling told Harriet everything she needed to know about its condition before she had even seen it. "There's a photograph," the solicitor offered, sliding a single curling print across the desk, for the avoidance of doubt. Harriet looked at it. It was indeed a shack, a low, stone-built thing the size of a double garage, hunched into the side of a fell under a roof that had given up some years ago, with a chimney leaning at an angle that suggested it was thinking about leaving. Around it, nothing but rough moorland grass and a dry stone wall that had collapsed in 3 places. It looked like the sort of place a story would warn children not to go into. Across the room, Davina laughed, a small, polite, cruel laugh that she turned into a cough. "Well," she said, "Aunt Edith always did have a sense of humor." Marcus was kinder, which was somehow worse. "Harriet, love, if it's a burden you don't want, I'd happily take it off your hands, save you the bother of the demolition costs. These places, you know, they're liabilities, not assets. You'd be paying to be rid of it." He smiled at her, warm and reasonable, the way he had smiled at her all through the childhood holidays when he had been the favored one, and she had been the quiet one, the one with no father and a mother who worked too much and a habit of disappearing into books that the family found faintly embarrassing. "Let me give you a few hundred for it, and we'll call it square. Family shouldn't be saddled with debts from family." Harriet looked at the photograph a little longer. Then she looked up at Marcus and she smiled and she said, "That's very kind, but I think I'll keep it." She watched the flicker of irritation cross his face before he smoothed it over. She had not expected to feel anything in that moment but the familiar, worn ache of being underestimated. Instead, she felt something sharper and more interesting, something she had not felt in a long time, because Harriet Loxley knew something that Marcus did not, that Davina did not, that the embarrassed solicitor did not, that no one in that overheated little room knew. She knew why her great-aunt Edith had left the shack to her and not to the others. And she knew it because Edith, in the last clear conversation they had ever had 3 weeks before she died, had taken Harriet's hand in her papery grip and said, "They'll laugh when they hear what I've left you. Let them. The cottage is worth £40,000. What's under the fell is worth a great deal more, and you're the only one of them clever enough to understand what it is. Don't tell them. Don't tell anyone. Go and look for yourself." Harriet had thought at the time that it was the wandering of a dying mind. Edith had been 91, and the morphine made her say strange things, but the will had been precise. The exclusion of the others from the fell had been deliberate, and Edith Loxley, whatever else she had been, had never in 91 years said a careless thing. So Harriet folded the photograph, put it in her bag, signed the papers that made her the owner of a collapsing shack on a Yorkshire fell, and drove north to find out what her great-aunt had been talking about. She had not told the family the other thing, either, the thing that would have changed how they looked at her, that would have stopped Marcus offering her a few £100 as though she were a child to be relieved of a sweet that might make her sick. She had not told them because they had never asked, because they had decided who Harriet was a long time ago and had never updated the picture. They thought she was a quiet woman in her late 30s who worked in a museum or something, who had never married, who lived in a rented flat and drove an old car and had no money and no prospects and no sense. The museum, or something, was the part they had never bothered to get right. Harriet Loxley was a geophysicist. More precisely, she was one of perhaps 24 people in the country who specialized in the non-invasive subsurface survey of archaeological and geological sites, ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, magnetometry, the patient science of seeing what lies beneath the ground without putting a single spade into it. She had spent 15 years walking slowly back and forth across fields and hillsides with instruments that most people mistook for lawnmowers, reading the faint electromagnetic ghosts of things buried for centuries. She had surveyed Roman villas and lost medieval villages and, twice, things that had quietly rewritten a chapter of a textbook. She did not earn much, because the work was specialized and the funding was thin, and she had never been the sort to push herself forward. But she was, in her narrow and unfashionable field, very nearly the best there was. And her great-aunt Edith, who had been a schoolteacher and a sharp one, and the only member of the family who had ever asked Harriet what she actually did, and then listened to the answer, had known it. What's under the fell is worth a great deal more, and you're the only one of them clever enough to understand what it is. The drive took 5 hours, the last of it on roads that narrowed and climbed, and finally gave out altogether into a rough track that Harriet's old estate car bumped along with a great deal of complaint. Crookback Fell rose ahead of her in the failing light, a long whaleback of moorland under a sky the color of slate, and the shack sat upon its flank exactly as in the photograph, only smaller and sadder and more alone. She parked and got out, and stood in the wind that came off the moor with the smell of peat and rain in it, and looked at the thing she now owned. It was a wreck. The roof had partly fallen in, the door hung off one hinge. Inside, when she pushed her way in with a torch, there was nothing but a single damp room with a flagged floor, a ruined fireplace, the wreckage of a few sticks of furniture, and the particular cold that gets into stone buildings that no one has loved for a long time. A mouse fled across the flags. The whole place could not have been worth the few £100 Marcus had offered. It would, as he'd said, cost more to demolish than it would ever fetch. And yet Edith had been precise. What's under the fell, not in the shack, under it, under the fell. Harriet swept the torch slowly across the flagged floor, and that was when she felt the first small electric stir of the thing that would, over the months to come, change everything. Because the flags were not laid as a cottage floor is laid. They were too large, too regular, too well cut for a poor moorland dwelling, great slabs of dressed stone, fitted close, of a quality that no one would ever waste on the floor of a shepherd's hut. Someone at some point had gone to enormous trouble and expense to lay a floor in this nothing place, and in one corner where a flag had cracked and subsided slightly, the torchlight caught the edge of something beneath it, a darkness that was not soil, a void, an empty space where there should have been only earth. Harriet knelt on the cold stone and put her eye close to the crack and felt the faint, unmistakable movement of air rising from below, air that had to be coming from somewhere, air that meant the darkness under the flag was not a few inches of disturbed ground but a space large enough to breathe. She did not pry the flag up. That was the difference between Harriet and almost anyone else who might have found themselves kneeling there. The years had trained the impulse out of her. You did not break into a thing before you understood it. You surveyed it first. You learned its shape from the outside, because the moment you put a spade in, you began to destroy the very evidence you were trying to read. She knelt there in the cold and the dark with the wind moaning over the fell above her, and she made herself a careful promise. She would do this properly. She would bring her instruments. She would map whatever lay beneath this floor before she so much as lifted a single stone. And she would tell no one, exactly as Edith had told her, until she knew what it was. She drove back to the nearest town that night, took a room above a pub, and lay awake for a long time listening to the rain, turning over the few facts she had. A poor shack with an impossibly expensive floor, a void beneath it breathing. A dying schoolteacher who had said it was worth a great deal, and who had chosen, out of all her relatives, the one who surveyed the underground for a living. It was not nothing. Edith had not been wandering. There was something under Crookback Fell, and Edith had spent her last lucid words making sure it came to the one person in the family equipped to find it and clever enough to keep quiet. The instruments came up from the storage unit where Harriet kept them, 200 miles south. Over the following week, the GPR array, the resistivity kit, the magnetometer, all of it loaded into the long-suffering estate car. She told her department she was taking the leave she was owed. She told the family nothing. And on a gray Tuesday morning, with the wind off the moor and no one for miles in any direction, Harriet Loxley began, slowly and methodically, to survey the ground beneath the shack she had been laughed at for keeping. The first day's results made her sit very still in the car for a long time afterwards, looking at the data on her laptop screen, her tea going cold in her hand. Because the void beneath the floor was not a cellar. It was not a hollow, not a collapsed drain, not any of the dull, explicable things she had told herself it might be. The radar return showed a regular, constructed space extending well beyond the footprint of the shack itself. A chamber, cut and built, with what looked like a passage leading off it, downward into the body of the fell. The resistivity data agreed. There was a built structure under Crookback Fell, deliberately hidden beneath a poor man's shack, of a size and regularity that no record, no map, no survey she had ever seen made the slightest mention of. And around its edges, faint but unmistakable in the magnetometry, was the signature of metal, a great deal of metal, distributed in a pattern that was not natural, that was not geological. That meant, though she would not let herself say the word, even alone in the car, until she had far more proof, that the chamber beneath the fell was not empty. Harriet Loxley closed the laptop and looked up at the hunched little shack on the hillside, and understood that her gray-tan Edith had left her something that the rest of the family, in their certainty about who she was, had handed over to her for a few £100 without ever once asking the only question that mattered. What's under the fell? She was going to find out. And she had the strong and growing sense, sitting there in the wind on the empty moor, that when she did, the people who had spent her whole life deciding she was no one in particular were going to have to learn her name all over again. Harriet surveyed for 9 days before she lifted a single stone, and in those 9 days she built, slice by careful slice, a three-dimensional picture of what lay beneath Crookback Fell, the kind of picture that no spade and no impatient treasure hunter could ever have produced, because the moment they dug they would have destroyed the very relationships between the things that gave them meaning. This was the discipline her family had mistaken for timidity all her life, the willingness to go slowly toward a thing she desperately wanted to reach. What she found, as the data accumulated on her laptop in the evenings above the pub, was this. The chamber beneath the floor was not large, perhaps 4 meters square, but it was the antechamber to something far bigger. From it, a passage ran downward into the body of the fell, lined with the same dressed stone as the floor, and opened after some 12 meters into a second, much larger space. A vaulted chamber, regular built, its roof held by what the radar suggested were stone piers. And throughout that lower chamber, dense in the magnetometry, lay the signature of metal, not in a single hoard but distributed, arranged in rows and groupings that spoke of deliberate placement. Not buried treasure flung into a hole, something stored. Something laid out with intention, by people who meant it to last, and then sealed beneath a shack on a forgotten fell so completely that for centuries no one had known it was there. Harriet did not yet know what it was, but she knew what it was not. It was not Roman, the construction was wrong, the masonry later. It was not a mine, there was no spoil, no shaft furniture, no record. And it was not, she was increasingly certain, anything that appeared in any archaeological record of England, which meant that it was either a forgery of extraordinary ambition or a genuine site that had escaped history entirely. And the patient honesty of the data, the way it refused to resolve into anything she already knew, told her it was the latter. On the 10th day, she lifted the cracked flag in the corner of the shack, carefully, recording everything, photographing each stage, and went down into the antechamber on a folding ladder with a torch and a camera and her heart going hard against her ribs. The air was cold and still and very old. The antechamber was empty, swept, its walls dressed and true. But set into the far wall, above the dark mouth of the descending passage, was a carved stone lintel, and on the lintel was an inscription. And when Harriet's torch found it, she sat down slowly on the cold floor because her legs had stopped being entirely reliable. It was not in Latin, it was not in English. It was in a hand and a language that she had seen only a handful of times in her life, in the most specialized corners of the most specialized journals, and that should not, by every rule of accepted history, have existed in the north of England at all. She photographed it. She did not touch it, and she climbed back up the ladder into the gray daylight and sat in her car and understood that whatever lay below was not merely valuable. It was the kind of thing that rewrote chapters. The kind of thing that careers were made and broken over. The kind of thing that, the moment it became known, would draw powerful people the way a wound draws flies. Which was the precise moment that her solitude on Crookback Fell came to an end. The car came up the track 2 mornings later, a clean, expensive, low-slung car entirely unsuited to a moorland track, driven with the careful resentment of a man who did not like getting his tires dirty. Harriet, who was packing her instruments into the estate car, watched it approach and felt something in her go still and careful, the way it had in the solicitor's office when Marcus had offered her a few £100. The man who got out was perhaps 55, silver-haired, dressed in the soft, expensive countryside clothes of a man who did not actually spend time in the country. He looked at the shack, and at the estate car full of instruments, and at Harriet, and he smiled the smile of a man who has decided in advance how a conversation is going to go. "Miss Loxley," he said. "Harriet Loxley, I do apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Lionel Asher. I represent a consortium with certain heritage interests in this part of the county." He produced a card, which Harriet did not take. "I understand you've recently come into possession of this charming little property. I wonder if we might have a word about its future." "How do you know who I am?" Harriet asked. She kept her voice level. "And how did you know I was here?" A small flicker quickly covered. "Word travels in a small county," Lionel Asher said, "and we've had an interest in Crookback Fell for some time. Geological, you understand. There's some thought the area might be suitable for a development. Renewable energy, that sort of thing. Very green, very worthy. We've been in quiet conversation with the family for a while, as it happens. Your cousin Marcus has been most helpful, and we were rather under the impression the land would be coming to him. It's caused us a little inconvenience finding it's come to you instead." The smile again. "But nothing that can't be put right. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer, substantially more than the land is worth. You'd walk away a good deal richer and spared the bother of a ruin you can't possibly want." So that was it, Harriet thought. That was how Marcus had been so quick to offer her a few £100 for the shack, so warm and reasonable about saving her the bother. He had already had a buyer. He had already been promised something for the fell, something that the buyer, this Lionel Asher and his consortium, wanted badly enough to come up a moorland track in the wrong car. And the moment the will had handed the land to Harriet instead, the whole quiet arrangement had been thrown into confusion, and they had come to fix it the way men like Asher fix things, with an offer dressed as a kindness, made to a woman they assumed had no idea what she was sitting on. "What's the consortium called?" Harriet asked. "And which renewable development needs a parcel of moorland this small, this remote, with no grid connection for miles?" She watched his face as she said it, and she saw the small recalibration there, the first dawning recognition that the quiet woman by the estate car was not going to be the easy transaction he had been told to expect. "You have questions," Asher said smoothly. "Of course you do. Why don't I have my people send you the full prospectus?" In the meantime, he named a figure, a large one, far more than the land could conceivably be worth as land. "That's our opening position. I'd urge you not to dismiss it. These offers have a way of not staying on the table. And the alternative, frankly, is being saddled with a derelict building, an unfarmable hillside, and the considerable costs of doing anything at all with either. A clever woman would take the money." "A clever woman," Harriet repeated and almost smiled. "Mr. Asher, I'll think about your offer. Send the prospectus. But I'm not going to make any decision about this land until I understand it properly. That's the only way I've ever made a decision in my life, and I'm too old to change." Asher's smile thinned just slightly. "Don't think too long," he said. "Sentiment about old buildings is an expensive luxury." He got back into his unsuitable car and reversed it with difficulty down the track and was gone. Harriet stood in the wind and thought hard. Asher had lied, and clumsily, in a way that told her more than the truth would have. There was no renewable development. You did not pay many times a parcel's value for remote, unconnected moorland to build a wind farm. You bought flat, accessible land near the grid for that. And Asher had given himself away twice. Once when he'd said the consortium had been interested in the fell for some time, before any wind farm fashion could explain it, and again in the flicker when she'd asked how he knew she was there. Someone had told him. Someone who knew she had gone north, who knew she was surveying, who knew enough to be worried. And the only people who knew she had inherited the shack, the only people who could have set Asher onto her, were the family. Marcus. "Most helpful," Asher had said. "Your cousin Marcus has been most helpful." But that still left the largest question, the one that mattered most. How did a heritage consortium know there was anything under Crookback Fell worth wanting? Edith had told no one but Harriet. The site appeared in no record, and yet Asher had come up the track with an offer many times the land's value, which meant that someone, somewhere, already knew, or strongly suspected, that the worthless shack sat on top of something that was not worthless at all. Which meant Harriet was not the first person to have learned the secret of Crookback Fell. She was merely the first person to have inherited the ground above it. She drove that afternoon to the county record's office in the nearest cathedral city, and she did what she always did when she needed to understand a thing. She went slowly toward it through the documents. She pulled the old tithe maps, the enclosure awards, the estate papers, anything that touched the fell. And there, in a bundle of 19th century estate correspondence that no one had looked at in living memory, she found the first thread. A letter dated 1851 from a land agent to the then owner of the Crookback estate, advising against any investigation of the old workings beneath the fell, on the grounds that the matter is best left undisturbed, both for the safety of the men and for reasons your late father will have made known to you. Reasons. Made known. A family that, a century and a half ago, had known there was something beneath the fell, had chosen deliberately to leave it sealed, and had passed the knowledge down quietly as a thing not to be disturbed. The Crookback estate had been broken up and sold off in pieces generations ago. The shack and its parcel had passed through several hands and ended, somehow, with Edith. But the knowledge had not died with the estate. Someone had kept it. Someone had remembered that beneath a forgotten fell, under a deliberately humble shack, lay something that an 1851 land agent had thought too dangerous to disturb. And now, in the present day, a man named Lionel Asher and his consortium wanted that ground badly enough to lie for it. Harriet sat in the hushed records office with the brittle old letter in her gloved hands and felt the shape of the thing settle around her. This was no longer a story about a quiet woman and a surprising inheritance. There was a chamber under the fell containing something that history had no record of and that someone had been determined for centuries to keep hidden. There was a present-day consortium that knew, or suspected, and was moving to acquire the ground before its true value could be understood. There was a cousin who had quietly tried to deliver the land into their hands, and been thwarted only by an old woman's precise and secret will. And there was Harriet, underestimated, written off, handed the ruin as a joke, who was now the single obstacle standing between Lionel Asher and whatever lay beneath Crookback Fell. She understood sitting there that the generous offer had been the easy approach, the one they always tried first. When it failed, and she had as good as told Asher it would fail, they would not simply shrug and walk away from something they had wanted for, by the sound of it, a very long time. They would try the next thing and the next, each less gentle than the last. They would question her title. They would question her competence. They would, if it came to it, question her sanity. Because a woman who turned down many times the value of a derelict shack must surely be unwell. And there is no easier person to remove from an inconvenient piece of ground than a woman the world has agreed to call unstable. Harriet had spent her whole life being quietly underestimated. She found now that the long apprenticeship had been good for something after all, because she knew exactly how it felt to be dismissed, and exactly how blind that dismissal made the people who indulged in it, and exactly how much room it left her to work in while they weren't looking. She photographed the 1851 letter. She returned it to its bundle. And on the drive back over the darkening moor, she made the decision that would define everything that followed. She was not going to sell. She was not going to dig it out herself and risk destroying it, or risk being robbed of it. She was going to do the one thing that Asher and his consortium and her grasping cousin would least expect, and least be able to fight, because it could not be bought off or frightened off or quietly buried. She was going to do it properly. She was going to make it official. She was going to take what lay beneath Crookback Fell, the chamber, the inscription, the laid-out metal, the secret an estate had kept for 2 centuries, out of the dark where powerful men could fight over it in private, and bring it into the full light of record and law and public knowledge, where it would belong not to Asher, not to Marcus, not even really to her, but to everyone forever beyond any of their reach. To do that, she would need allies she could trust, evidence no one could dispute, and the patience to assemble both before Asher realized what she was doing. She would need to move quietly while they assumed she was doing nothing. She would need, in short, to be exactly the woman her family had always insisted she wasn't. She got back to the shack as the last light went out of the sky, and stood for a moment in the wind, looking at the dark mouth of the doorway and the deeper dark beneath it. "All right, Aunt Edith," she said softly, to the cold and the moor and the memory of a sharp old woman who had chosen her on purpose. "I understand now. I'll do it properly, and I won't tell them until it's too late for them to stop it." Then she got into her car and drove down off the fell, and began, carefully, patiently, entirely unnoticed, to build the thing that would, in the end, leave Lionel Asher and everyone who had underestimated Harriet Loxley standing in the full glare of a truth they could no longer control. There is a particular kind of power in being thought to be doing nothing, and Harriet used it the way she used everything else, carefully and to the full. While Lionel Asher waited for her to crack under the pressure of his generous offer, while he sent her the promised prospectus full of glossy renderings of wind turbines that would never be built, while he let the silence stretch in the way men like him believed wore women down, Harriet was working harder and more precisely than she had ever worked in her life. She simply did it where he could not see. She began with the inscription. She had photographed the lintel carefully, and she sent the images under a careful cover story to the one person in the country she trusted to read them, Dr. Niam Brennan, a paleographer she had worked with years before on a site in the Borders, a woman as quiet and as unfashionable in her field as Harriet was in hers, and as exacting. Niam did not answer for 4 days. When she did, she telephoned, and her voice had the same unsteady quality Harriet had heard in her own breathing when she first saw the carving. "Where did you find this?" Niam asked. "And before you answer, Harriet, Do you understand what you're sending me? Because if this is genuine, if this is in situ and not a forgery and not something pulled out of a private collection, then it is not possible. It should not exist. Not here, not in the north of England. Do you understand me? Tell me what it says, Harriet said. And Niam told her. And Harriet sat with the phone against her ear and her free hand pressed flat on the table, steadying herself against the size of it, as the meaning of the chamber beneath Crookback Fell finally came clear. Older than anyone's history of the place, the record of a people, and a moment that the accepted story of England had no room for, sealed away and deliberately forgotten, because the truth it contained had been, in its own time and in every time since, inconvenient to the people who profited from the story as it was told. Edith had been right. It was worth a great deal, but not in money. It was worth a great deal in the way that the truth is always worth a great deal, to everyone, and to no one's private profit, which was exactly why men like Asher needed it kept in the dark where it could be controlled. Harriet understood then the full shape of what she had to do, and why doing it properly was not caution but the only possible victory. If she sold, it vanished into a consortium's vaults or was quietly destroyed to clear the ground. If she dug it out and announced it herself, alone, an unfunded woman with no institution behind her, she would be disbelieved, discredited, swallowed, the lone female crank with the unbelievable claim, exactly the figure Asher would need her to be. The only way to make the truth unkillable was to make it official, witnessed, and shared, all at once, in front of so many credible people that no consortium and no cousin could ever put it back in the ground. So she built her case the way she had built every survey of her life, in layers, each one verified before she laid the next. She brought Niam north, quietly, to see the inscription in situ and document it under proper conditions. She contacted, one by one, a small number of people she had judged across 15 years to be both expert and incorruptible, a field archaeologist with a national reputation and a horror of treasure hunters, a heritage lawyer who had spent her career fighting exactly the kind of quiet acquisition Asher represented, a curator from a national institution who could speak with the authority that Harriet, alone, could not. She told each of them only as much as they needed, swore each to confidence, and asked each the same thing. Come and see, judge for yourself, and if I am right, help me bring it into the light before it can be taken. They came, over the following weeks, in ones and twos, on gray moorland mornings when no expensive car would risk the track. They went down the folding ladder into the antechamber. They saw the inscription. They saw, when Harriet's careful survey had guided the smallest, least destructive of openings into the lower chamber, the laid-out metal, not gold flung in a hole, but the ordered, deliberate deposit of a vanished moment of history, exactly where it had been placed and never disturbed. And one by one, the experts Harriet had chosen came back up the ladder changed, the way she had been changed, and said some version of the same thing. This is real, this is important beyond words, and it must be protected. And while they did, Lionel Asher grew impatient, and then alarmed, and then exactly as dangerous as Harriet had known he would become. The first move was against her title. A letter arrived from a firm of solicitors Harriet had never heard of, asserting on behalf of an unnamed client a historic interest in the Crookback parcel, and questioning the validity of Edith's bequest. It was nonsense, and the heritage lawyer Harriet had recruited dismantled it in a single afternoon, but its purpose was not to win. It was to frighten, to suggest that fighting would be ruinous, to make a clever woman take the money after all. When that failed, the second move came, and it was the one Harriet had predicted on the drive back from the records office, the questioning of her competence and then of her mind. An item appeared in a regional paper placed, she had no doubt, by Asher's people, about a lone woman conducting unauthorized excavations on a dangerous derelict site, hinting at instability, at obsession, at a vulnerable person who had inherited a property she could not cope with and was endangering herself and others. It was the oldest move in the book, and it was aimed with precision at the exact place Harriet had been wounded her whole life. The assumption that the quiet woman did not quite know what she was doing. But this time the wound had armor over it, because this time Harriet was not alone, and not undocumented, and not unwitnessed. Every step she had taken had been recorded. Every expert who had come to the fell had come precisely, so that the story could never be reduced to one unstable woman's word. And the more Asher's people pushed the narrative of the lone female crank, the more cleanly it would shatter when the truth came out. Because there is no more complete reversal than the moment a crowd realizes that the person they were invited to dismiss was, all along, the only one in the room who understood. Harriet chose her ground for that moment with the same care she chose everything. The county's principal museum and historical society held an annual public lecture in the cathedral city, a large, well-attended evening, covered by the regional press, attended by exactly the mix of academics, officials, journalists, and local worthies in front of whom a truth, once spoken, could never again be unsaid. Through the curator she had recruited, Harriet arranged to be given the floor for a presentation billed only blandly as a recent discovery in the county. She told no one in the family. She told no one connected to Asher. She did, however, make very sure, through a carefully placed word she knew would travel, that Lionel Asher and her cousin Marcus would both learn of the lecture in time to attend, because a reversal is not complete unless the people being reversed are in the room to feel it. They came. Of course they came. Asher, silver and confident, certain he was attending to monitor a problem he still believed he could manage. Marcus, curious and faintly proprietary, still telling himself that his quiet cousin's strange business on the fell was an embarrassment he might yet turn to his advantage. They took seats near the front, among the people whose good opinion they had spent their lives cultivating. And they watched the quiet woman they had each, in their way, written off, walk to the lectern in the full hall, set down her notes and begin to speak. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. She laid it out the way she had laid out the survey, in order, each layer verified before the next. She showed the hall the worthless shack, and the floor too fine for a shepherd's hut, and the void that breathed. She showed them the survey data, the chamber, the passage, the laid-out metal, the proof that she had read the ground without harming it, the discipline that made every later claim unassailable. She showed them the inscription, and she let Dr. Niam Brennan rise from the audience and tell the hall, in careful expert words, what it was and why it should not exist, and why its existence changed what they thought they knew about the very ground beneath their county. She showed them the 1851 letter and the 2 centuries of deliberate silence, and she let the field archaeologist and the curator and the heritage lawyer each stand, in turn, named and credentialed and unimpeachable, and confirm what they had seen with their own eyes on Crookback Fell. And then, only then, when the truth stood in the hall fully built and fully witnessed and entirely beyond recall, Harriet did the one thing that turned a discovery into a reckoning. She told them about the offer. She named the many times its value sum a heritage consortium had pressed on her for a parcel of worthless moorland. She described, without heat, the questioning of her title, the placed newspaper item, the careful suggestion that she was an unstable lone woman endangering herself on a derelict site. She did not accuse anyone by name. She did not have to. She simply asked the hall a single quiet question. Why would anyone pay a fortune and work so hard to discredit one woman, to get their hands on a hillside they claimed was worthless? And let every person in the room follow the logic to its only possible answer, and let their eyes travel as one to the silver-haired man near the front who had gone very still in his seat. It is a particular thing to watch a room change its mind. Harriet had imagined it on the long nights above the pub, but the reality was quieter and more total than she had imagined. There was no uproar. There was simply a shift, the same shift, though she could not have known it, that had passed through a paneled livery hall 200 miles south in another woman's story, the decisive, irreversible movement of a crowd reassigning its respect. She watched it leave Asher, who had walked in as a man of consequence, and would walk out as a man who had tried to buy and bury the most important find the county had seen in a century. She watched it leave Marcus, who had offered his quiet cousin a few £100 and a pitying smile, and who now sat among his peers and felt them understand, all at once, exactly what he had tried to do and exactly who he had tried to do it to. And she watched it come to her, not as applause, though the applause came too, but as the thing she had been denied her whole life and had finally, on her own terms and through her own patient work, compelled the world to give her. She watched the room see her clearly, and know her name, and understand that the quiet woman at the lectern had been, all along, the most important person in the story. The justice that followed was the slow, unglamorous, permanent kind that Harriet trusted more than any other. Once the discovery was public, witnessed, and documented, it could not be undone. The proper authorities took it up. The site was protected under law, excavated properly over the years that followed by people who treated it with the care it deserved. Its contents preserved not in any consortium's vault, but in the public record belonging to everyone, exactly as Harriet had intended from the moment she understood what it was. Lionel Asher's consortium dissolved into the shadows it had come from, and Asher himself, exposed as the front man for an attempt to acquire and suppress a national treasure for private gain, found that the rooms he had spent his life being welcomed into were no longer warm to him, which, for a man like Asher, was the only sentence that would ever have stung. There was no prison for him. His crime had been greed and deception rather than anything the law had a tidy name for. But the respect he had traded on was gone, and it does not come back, and Harriet found that sufficient. Marcus came to find her once in the months after, humbled in the careful, self-justifying way of a man who has been caught, and is trying to rewrite himself as the victim of a misunderstanding. He had not known, he said, what the consortium really wanted. He had only been trying to be helpful. He hoped there were no hard feelings. Family was family. Harriet listened to him the way she listened to everything, without interrupting, and when he had finished she said only that she understood him perfectly, which was true, and which was not at all what he had hoped to hear. She did not need to punish Marcus. The fell had done it. He would spend the rest of his life as the man who had tried to take the shack off Harriet for a few £100, and the whole family knew it, and that was a more exact justice than anything Harriet could have devised. She did not become rich in the end, in the way the family had briefly and resentfully imagined she might. There was no fortune in the chamber for any private person to keep. That had always been the point. She received the modest, proper recognitions that come to a person who has done something quietly important, a finder's acknowledgement, a measure of standing in her unfashionable field, the lasting respect of the few exacting people whose respect she had ever wanted. What she gained that mattered was not money. It was the thing Edith had seen in her and chosen her for, the chance to take a hidden truth out of the dark, against the will of powerful people, and give it to the light permanently where it could never be bought or buried again. She kept the shack. People found that strange as they had found her keeping it strange in the first place, and she let them. She had a new roof put on it, and the floor relayed by people who understood what lay beneath, and she went up to Crookback Fell when she could, and sat in the wind off the moor, and felt close to the sharp old woman who had handed her, in a single secret sentence, the thing no one else in the family had been clever enough to want. And once, near the end of a long day on the fell, a young woman who had come to work on the proper excavation, a student junior, the kind of quiet, careful person Harriet recognized at once because she had been her, asked Harriet how she had known, how she had looked at a worthless ruin everyone laughed at and seen what was underneath. Harriet thought about it for a while, the way she thought about everything before she answered. They didn't laugh because the shack was worthless, she said at last. They laughed because they'd decided who I was a long time ago, and a person they decided was no one couldn't possibly have been given anything that mattered. So they didn't look. That's the whole secret. The people who are certain they already know what's in front of them stop looking at it. And what they stop looking at is exactly where the truth goes to wait. She nodded down at the dark mouth of the chamber, and up at the empty moor, and at the small repaired shack that had held its secret for 2 centuries while the world walked past it. "Don't ever stop looking at the things people tell you aren't worth looking at," she said, "especially when they tell you that you aren't. That's usually where they've hidden the most important thing of all." Then she gathered her instruments and walked down off Crookback Fell in the last of the light, a quiet woman the world had finally been made to see, not because she had demanded it, but because she had done the patient, unglamorous, unbreakable work of making the truth too large to ignore. Which was, she had come to understand, the only kind of being seen that was ever worth having.